All right, let's jump right in, folks. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, we're diving deep today, deep into how U.S. power really works, how those big decisions on foreign policy, how they really get made. You ready for this?
Oh, absolutely. And you know what makes this deep dive extra special? We've got insights from someone who was right there in the room where it happened.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
We're talking about retired Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Wilkerson. The name rings a bell.
He was chief of staff to Colin Powell, when Powell was Secretary of State.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're not talking about some armchair analyst here. This is someone who is right at the heart of it all.
Right. This is someone who's seen it all.
What kind of stuff did he see? I mean, what can you tell us about his background?
Okay, so picture this. Vietnam War. He served there as a soldier.
Wow, Vietnam. That's a heavy start.
Yeah. And then he went on to navigate, the complex world of strategy, diplomacy. He did tours in Korea and Japan.
Okay, so he's moving up the ranks.
Oh, yeah. And then it gets even more interesting. He spent time at Pacific Command during the Cold War.
Pacific Command during the Cold War. So we're talking about potential conflict with the Soviet Union, nuclear threats, all of that.
Exactly. He was actually working on plans for potential conflict with the Soviets. Those were high-stakes times, man.
No kidding. Talk about pressure.
And then, of course, there's his time working with Colin Powell. First, when Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then as Secretary of State. So from boots on the ground to the highest levels of government, he's seen it all from every angle.
Wow, that's quite a journey. What a perspective he must have.
Right. And one of the things that he revealed that really blew my mind was this statement from a U.S. national security strategy document. It said, "We will achieve and maintain global hegemony at any cost."
Global hegemony at any cost. Hold on, break that down for me. What does that even mean?
Well, it means dominance on a global scale. Political, economic, military, you name it. We're talking about being the top dog, the big boss, no matter what.
Okay, so not just being a major player, but actually ruling the world, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like those historical empires that tried to conquer everything and everyone. It rarely ends well.
And this was official U.S. strategy, like written down in black and white.
Yeah, Colonel Wilkerson actually saw the creation of this document firsthand. And he wasn't on board with it at all. He understood the implications, the dangers of this kind of thinking.
Yeah, I can imagine. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, always trying to be on top, no matter the cost. It makes me wonder who came up with this idea in the first place.
Well, it turns out this wasn't the first time this kind of thinking had popped up. Colonel Wilkerson actually talked about an earlier draft of a similar strategy document during the George H.W. Bush presidency.
Oh, right. I think I've heard about this. Didn't Bush completely reject that document?
He sure did. And you know what he called the people behind it? The crazies in the bottom of the Pentagon.
The crazies. Wow, that's pretty blunt coming from a president.
Yeah.
So who are these so-called crazies? What do they believe? How did they end up having so much influence?
Well, it wasn't just a few isolated people. They were part of a larger movement called neoconservatism. It started gaining traction after the Cold War, but 9/11 really gave it a boost. Like it was the perfect opportunity for their ideas to take hold.
So 9/11 wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point in U.S. foreign policy. It gave these maybe previously fringe ideas a chance to become mainstream.
Yeah, exactly. Neoconservatism is all about American military strength. They believe it's the main tool to shape the world, to spread democracy, even if it means using force, maybe even preemptive force, to achieve their goals.
So a very proactive, some might even say aggressive, approach to foreign policy.
You could say that. And this leads to another one of Colonel Wilkerson's thought-provoking points. He actually claims that the most powerful position in the U.S. government isn't the president, but the Secretary of Defense.
Really? The
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense. That's interesting. Why would he say that?
Well, when you think about it, the Secretary of Defense controls a massive budget. The military, they have a lot of sway over foreign policy.
True. They have their hands on the levers of military power, for sure.
Exactly. And Colonel Wilkerson actually shared this anecdote. Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, his budget was $25 billion.
Okay, $25 billion, that's still a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. But guess how much Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, had?
I don't know. Give me a hint.
Way more. Much more. $375 billion.
$375 billion. Wow, that's a massive difference. I can see why Colonel Wilkerson would say the Secretary of Defense has more power.
Rumsfeld even joked to Powell, "I lose more money than you get, Colin."
Ouch. Well, that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Money talks, especially in Washington.
It sure does. So you've got these powerful figures, these big budgets, these ideologies shaping decisions about war and peace. And it leads to what Colonel Wilkerson and his students called fateful decisions. Decisions to send troops into harm's way. You won't believe this, but he spent 16 years teaching a course on national security decision making.
16 years. That's a long time to be thinking about these things. Where did he teach?
He taught at both civilian and military universities, places like William and Mary and George Washington University.
So he was training the next generation of policymakers, the people who would actually be making these fateful decisions in the future.
Exactly. And they spent all this time analyzing past decisions, trying to figure out how and why they were made, what led to those choices.
And what did they find? Was there a pattern?
Well, they identified 5 key factors that influence these big decisions. Who is actually making the call, what's going on internationally at the time, what's happening domestically, whether the process is legal, and the ideology behind the decision.
So it's not just about some abstract idea of national interest. It's about the people involved, their personalities, their beliefs.
Right, exactly. And Colonel Wilkerson makes this really important point. The people making these life or death decisions, they're not always the smartest or the most qualified. He even had his students run simulations of the National Security Council just to show them how complex and messy these decisions can be.
Oh, like role-playing, putting themselves in the shoes of those decision makers.
Yeah, and afterwards, the students would often say things like, I would have made a better decision than that. It's really eye-opening. If the people in the room have this much power, what does that mean for accountability?
It's a great question. And if they're not always the best and brightest, that makes it even more important to understand how they're making those choices.
Absolutely. And it doesn't stop there. Colonel Wilkerson also raises concerns about the role of intelligence in all of this. He talks about how the U.S. intelligence community has grown into this massive beast with 17 different entities, all competing for influence and resources.
17? Wow, that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. What kind of problems does that create?
Well, he says there's a real risk that the intelligence system becomes more focused on telling the president what he wants to hear, rather than providing objective analysis. Nobody wants to deliver bad news, especially when it comes to national security.
So there's a danger of groupthink, confirmation bias, all of those cognitive traps that can lead to bad decisions.
Exactly. He even shares this chilling example about the intelligence on those aluminum tubes in the lead up to the Iraq War. Remember those?
Oh, yeah, those tubes that were supposedly evidence of Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program.
Right. Turns out it was faulty intelligence, but it played a big part in justifying the invasion. And it makes you wonder how often this kind of thing happens, where crucial information is ignored or suppressed because it doesn't fit the narrative.
A very disturbing thought. So how do we ensure that intelligence is objective and used responsibly? That's a big question, especially in today's world where information, disinformation, everything's swirling around.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Now, are you ready to dive into some even more controversial waters?
Bring it on. What do we got?
It's time to talk about Israel's role in U.S. foreign policy. Buckle up.
Okay, this is always a hot topic. I'm really curious to hear Colonel Wilkerson's take on this.
Oh, he has a very unique perspective, one that challenges the common narrative. The idea that Israel somehow controls the U.S. government. He actually argues that Israel is a tool of U.S. foreign policy.
A tool? That's a bold statement. So he's saying the U.S. is using Israel for its own purposes.
He believes the U.S. has intentionally fostered and supported Israel as a strategic asset in the Middle East, a way to project power in that unstable region.
But what about those powerful pro-Israel lobbying groups we always hear about, like AIPAC? Don't they have a huge influence on policy?
He acknowledges their power, especially over members of Congress, how they can influence votes and things like that. He even says a lot of those Congress members are pretty uninformed and easily swayed when it comes to foreign policy.
So he's not dismissing their influence entirely, but he's saying there's more to it than just lobbying.
Right. The real drivers of U.S.-Israel policy, he says, are operating at a higher level. It's more about strategic calculations than simple pressure from interest groups.
Okay, that makes sense. So he sees Israel serving U.S. interests in a specific way. How so?
Well, he thinks Israel acts as a kind of buffer against perceived threats in the region. It also provides valuable intelligence and military cooperation to the U.S.
Right, so it's a mutually beneficial relationship in a lot of ways.
To a point, yeah. But it's not always smooth sailing. There have been times when U.S. presidents have clashed with Israel, even putting pressure on them to change their policies.
Oh, I'm sure. Can you give me some examples?
He mentions Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, both presidents who took stances that weren't popular with the Israeli government.
Like what? What kind of stances?
Well, Carter, for example, he really pushed for peace between Israel and Egypt. And Bush Sr., he actually pressured Israel to stop building settlements in the occupied territories.
Wow, those are both pretty big deals, and I bet that caused a lot of tension.
Oh, absolutely. And Colonel Wilkerson actually suggests that these clashes, standing up to Israel, might have even contributed to both of those presidents losing their bids for re-election.
Wow, that's high-stakes diplomacy.
It is. It's like a game of chess where every move has consequences. And speaking of high stakes, remember those shadows Colonel Wilkerson hinted at? The powerful, unelected people who exert influence behind the scenes.
Yeah, the ones pulling the strings without anyone knowing. They sounded kind of scary.
They do, right? Well, he says they've become even more powerful lately, especially since the George W. Bush presidency. And it's all happening under the radar, shaping U.S. foreign policy in ways most people don't even realize.
So it's like there's this whole other level of government operating in the shadows.
It kind of feels that way, yeah.
And that raises so many questions like, who are these shadowy figures? What do they want? How can we hold them accountable?
All good questions. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's a glimpse into a world that most of us never see.
It's like peeking behind the curtain and seeing how the wizard really works.
Exactly. And it's not always pretty.
Yeah, it's a bit unnerving, to be honest. It makes you wonder how much control we, the people, really have over these decisions that affect our lives so profoundly.
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. But let's get back to those decisions, especially the ones that lead to military action. Colonel Wilkerson and his students, they spent years studying this, poring over all these historical examples, trying to figure out how those decisions were made.
And they were looking at specific wars. Or just military action in general. All
sorts of situations where the U.S. sent troops into harm's way. And one thing they realized, that might surprise you, it's not always a single decision that leads to something like, a full-blown war.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just like one big meeting where everyone says yes or no, and then that's it.
Right, it's more complicated than that. It's usually a series of decisions, a chain reaction almost. They call it a decision set.
A decision set. So each decision builds on the one before it.
Yeah, like a domino effect almost. Yeah. You make one decision and then that leads to another, and before you know it, you're in too deep.
So it's like a slippery slope.
You could say that. Colonel Wilkerson actually used the analogy of a military, reinforcing a defeat instead of backing down.
Oh, I see. Trying to salvage a bad situation only make it worse.
Yeah, and it often just leads to a bigger defeat in the end. They called it reinforcing failure.
That's a powerful image. So it's not just about making the right decision at the start. It's also about recognizing when things aren't working and being willing to change course, even if it means admitting you made a mistake, which I imagine is really tough for politicians to do.
Oh, totally. Nobody wants to look weak, especially not on the world stage.
Speaking of mistakes, what about the role of intelligence in all of this? We talked about those aluminum tubes earlier, the faulty intelligence that was used to justify the Iraq War. Did Colonel Wilkerson have anything to say about that?
He did, and his students were especially alarmed by how the U.S. intelligence system has evolved over the years. With 17 different intelligence entities all vying for influence and resources, it can be a real mess.
17, that's just mind-boggling. No wonder things get lost in the shuffle.
Right, and Colonel Wilkerson says there's a real danger that this system, with all its competing interests, becomes more concerned with telling the president what he wants to hear than with providing objective analysis.
Oh yeah, we all want to please the boss, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to national security, the stakes are so high.
Exactly. He actually talked about cases where people who disagreed with the prevailing view were deliberately excluded from important meetings.
Seriously, they just shut them out.
They sure did. He mentioned this one analyst, they called him Joe Turner, to protect his identity.
Okay, Joe Turner, what did he do?
Well, he had serious doubts about the intelligence regarding those infamous aluminum tubes. The ones they said were proof that Saddam Hussein was building nuclear weapons.
Right.
And guess what? When they were making the final intelligence assessment, Joe Turner was conveniently out of town.
Conveniently? You think that was a coincidence?
Not at all. Colonel Wilkerson says George Tenet, the director of Central Intelligence at the time, made sure Joe Turner was out of the picture.
Wow, so they were actively manipulating the intelligence to fit their narrative.
It sure looks that way.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how many other times this has happened, how many inconvenient truths have been buried or ignored.
It's a really scary thought. It makes you question everything you hear. Now, what about Donald Trump? Didn't he have issues with the intelligence community too?
He did, but in a different way. He actually wanted to restructure the whole thing, give more power to the Director of National Intelligence, and streamline the process.
So he was trying to cut through the bureaucracy and get information straight from the source, like no filter.
Yeah, that was the idea. But Colonel Wilkerson isn't so sure that would have worked. He thinks the intelligence community is just too powerful, too entrenched.
Right, even a president like Trump couldn't just shake things up that easily.
It's like trying to turn a giant ship around. It takes time, effort, and a lot of political will.
Okay, so we've got intelligence agencies with their own agendas, powerful figures operating behind the scenes, and presidents who are trying to navigate this incredibly complex system. It all sounds very messy.
It is. It's all connected.
Yeah.
Institutions, power dynamics, individual personalities, it all comes together in ways that most people never even think about.
Absolutely. And now for the million-dollar question, what about Israel? What did Colonel Wilkerson have to say about their role in all of this?
All right, let's dive into those controversial waters. Are you ready for this?
Hit me with it.
Well, remember how we talked about Colonel Wilkerson challenging the common narrative about Israel controlling the U.S. government?
Yeah.
Well, he doubles down on that. He's adamant that Israel isn't calling the shots. In fact, he argues that Israel is actually a tool of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, we've got to unpack this. He called it a tool earlier, but what does that really mean?
He believes the U.S. has very deliberately nurtured and supported Israel as a strategic asset in the Middle East. It's all about projecting power in a region that's notoriously volatile.
So Israel's like a pawn in a bigger game.
In a way, yeah. But it's a complicated relationship for sure. What about all those powerful pro-Israel lobbying groups we always hear about, like AIPAC? Surely they have some influence.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. They're not exactly shy about their goals.
Colonel Wilkerson acknowledges their influence, especially over members of Congress. But he says a lot of those congressmen, they're pretty clueless when it comes to foreign policy. Easily swayed, he says.
So he's saying it's not as simple as, AIPAC snapping its fingers and Congress jumping.
Right. The real drivers of U.S.-Israel policy, he says, are operating at a much higher level. It's about strategic calculations, not just lobbying pressure.
Okay, that makes sense. So in Colonel Wilkerson's view, how exactly does Israel serve U.S. interests?
Well, for one thing, he sees Israel as a buffer against potential threats in the region. It's like a forward operating base for American power. And Israel also provides valuable intelligence and military cooperation to the U.S.
Right, so it's a mutually beneficial relationship, at least on the surface.
Yeah, but it's not without its conflicts. There have been times when U.S. presidents have clashed with Israel, even pressured them to change their policies.
Oh, I'm sure. Can you give me some examples?
He talks about Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. They both took stances that weren't popular with the Israeli government, and they faced some pretty serious blowback for it.
Like what kind of stances?
Well, Carter, for instance, he was really pushing for peace between Israel and Egypt, which didn't sit well with some hardliners in Israel. And Bush Sr., he actually pressured Israel to stop building settlements in the occupied territories.
Wow, those are both pretty bold moves.
They were. And Colonel Wilkerson actually suggests that these clashes, these presidents standing up to Israel, might have even contributed to them losing their bids for re-election. So the political cost of challenging Israel can be pretty high.
Apparently so. It's like there are certain red lines you just don't cross if you want to stay in power.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act for sure.
Oh.
Okay, remember those shadows we talked about earlier? The powerful figures working behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, the ones who are really calling the shots.
Yeah.
What about them?
Colonel Wilkerson says their influence has grown even stronger in recent years, especially since the George W. Bush presidency. It's like they become emboldened, operating with even less accountability.
And why do you think that is?
Well, he points to a specific moment in 2004 when Bush basically handed over control of foreign policy to people like Ari Fleischer, his press secretary. And from that point on, these unelected advisors had a lot more freedom to do what they wanted.
So a shift in power from elected officials to unelected advisors. That's pretty troubling.
It is. And it's not just a Bush-era phenomena. Colonel Wilkerson says this trend continued under later administrations.
So Obama and Trump, they both had these powerful advisors operating behind the scenes.
Yeah, and it wasn't always clear how much control those presidents actually had over them. It's like there's this shadow government operating in parallel to the official one.
And these advisors, did they all have the same agenda? Or were they pulling in different directions?
That's a good question. It probably varied depending on the administration and the individuals involved, but Colonel Wilkerson specifically mentions Joe Biden. Despite all his experience in foreign policy, he's had some real challenges dealing with his own advisors.
Really? What kind of challenges?
Well, he talks about Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, both very influential figures in the Biden administration. They definitely had their own ideas about how things should be done, and it didn't always align with Biden's vision.
So, a bit of a power struggle within the administration.
You could say that. He even describes Blinken as acting like Benjamin Netanyahu's guy within the State Department, which must have made things really awkward for Biden.
Awkward is an understatement, I'd say, especially given Biden's own views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right. It sounds like Biden came in wanting to change course on a lot of issues, but he faced a lot of resistance, even from his own team.
It makes you wonder if any president can truly escape the influence of these powerful advisors, whether they're elected or not.
Yeah, it's a good question. Colonel Wilkerson even shared this anecdote about a conversation he had with Colin Powell. Powell knew Biden pretty well, but he wasn't convinced that Biden was the right man for the job.
Really? Why not?
Well, Powell thought that senators, just by the nature of their job, they're not used to the kind of responsibility and accountability that comes with being president.
I see. It's one thing to debate policy in the Senate, but quite another to actually make those decisions and live with the consequences.
Right. And Powell felt that Biden just wasn't cut out for that, even with all his foreign policy knowledge. It's a fascinating insight coming from someone who's been in those rooms, who's seen how the sausage gets made.
Absolutely. It really makes you think about the kind of person it takes to be president, the pressures they face, the difficult choices they have to make.
Yeah, it's not a job for the faint of heart, that's for sure. And this deep dive, it's given us a glimpse behind the curtain, showing us how power really works, how decisions get made, and how much influence these unelected individuals can have. It's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
It is. And it leaves us with so many questions, so much to ponder. If these individuals have this much power, how can we hold them accountable? How can we ensure that the people making these decisions are actually representing our interests?
Those are questions we all need to be asking.
Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it, like this whole other level of government operating in the shadows.
It makes you wonder how much we really know about how things work.
Right, like who's really in charge? And Colonel Wilkerson seems to think that this whole unelected people having power thing, it's actually gotten worse in recent years.
Worse. How so?
Well, he said it really became noticeable during the George W. Bush administration, especially after 9/11. With everything going on, that sense of urgency, people felt like they needed to act quickly, decisively. And that's when these advisors, the unelected ones, they started to gain more and more influence.
So it's like a crisis creates an opportunity for those in the shadows to kind of step in and take control.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they seize the moment. And once they have that power, it's really hard to get it back.
Makes sense. And this didn't just stop with Bush.
No, not at all. He said it continued under Obama and even Trump.
Wow. So each administration had its own set of these, power players operating behind the scenes.
Yeah, and it wasn't always clear how much control the actual president had over these advisors. Were they really calling the shots?
It's almost like there's this, shadow government running things.
Right. And we're all just going along with it, completely oblivious.
Kind of a creepy thought. Colonel Wilkerson actually mentioned that Joe Biden, with all his experience, even he had trouble with this.
Really? Even Biden?
Yeah. He talked about Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. Those guys, they had their own ideas about how things should be done. And it wasn't always what Biden wanted.
So a bit of a clash of wills, even within the administration.
Yeah, you could say that. Colonel Wilkerson actually described Blinken as acting almost like Netanyahu's representative inside the State Department.
Wow, that's going to be tough. Having someone on your own team who seems to be working for another country's interests.
Yeah, and that must have made things really difficult for Biden, trying to navigate all those competing agendas.
You'd think with all his foreign policy experience, he'd be able to handle it.
Well, Colonel Wilkerson actually shared a pretty interesting story about this. He had a conversation with Colin Powell.
Yeah.
Powell knew Biden pretty well.
Right. They both served in government for a long time.
Yeah. And Powell, well, he wasn't so sure that Biden was actually cut out for the job. He had doubts.
Really? Why? What made him think that?
He thought that senators, just by the nature of the job, they're not really used to that level of responsibility, that kind of accountability that comes with being president.
So it's one thing to talk about policy, debate it, cast votes, but it's another thing entirely to be the one making those decisions, knowing that people's lives are on the line.
Exactly. And Powell, he just felt that Biden wasn't quite ready for that kind of pressure, even with all his experience.
Makes sense. It's a huge leap from being a senator to being the leader of the free world.
It is. And this deep dive, it's been a real eye-opener. We've learned so much about the hidden workings of power, how those big decisions get made, all the behind-the-scenes maneuvering, the influence of these shadowy figures. It's pretty wild stuff.
Totally agree. It's like we've peeled back the layers of the onion and seen what's really going on. And honestly, it's a little unsettling.
It is, right? It makes you think twice about everything you hear.
Exactly. But that's what makes this so important, We need to understand how power works if we want to hold our leaders accountable, if we want to make a difference in the world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. This has definitely been one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
Absolutely. We've gone from Vietnam to the halls of power in Washington, from shadowy figures to presidential power struggles. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And we hope it's left you with a lot to think about, too.
Definitely. It's important to stay informed, to keep asking questions, to never take anything at face value.
Because the more we know about how the world really works, the better equipped we'll be to navigate it, to make our voices heard, and maybe even change it for the better.
Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear.